This happened about 6 years ago, but it still creeps me out when I think about it. I was 24 at the time, back home in rural Kansas after graduating college. I'd been living in the city for a few years, so coming back to wide open spaces and cornfields stretching for miles felt both peaceful and isolating. My parents' farmhouse was tucked right at the edge of a massive cornfield, one that seemed to go on forever. As a kid, I'd played hide-and-seek there with the neighbors, but I was always careful not to wander too deep. Stories of people getting lost or encountering strange things in the corn had circulated for years. I used to brush them off, but after what I experienced, I'm not so sure anymore. It started one humid evening in early August. My parents had gone into town for dinner, leaving me alone on the property. I decided to spend some time outside, soaking in the quiet. The sun was setting, and the field looked golden under the fading light, its stalks swaying gently in the breeze. As I sat on the back porch, I heard a faint rustling in the corn. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was irregular, stopping and starting like something, or someone, was moving through the rows. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, but the longer I listened, the more uneasy I felt. It sounded too deliberate, too purposeful. I stood up, scanning the edge of the field. Nothing. The stalks stood tall and still, almost unnaturally so. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the corn, half hidden by the stalks. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark, ragged clothing. At first, I thought it might be one of the neighbors, but something about their stillness set me on edge. They just stood there, motionless, as though watching me. I called out, "Hello? Can I help you?" But they didn't respond. The breeze picked up, and the stalks shifted, momentarily obscuring them. When the corn settled, the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or someone passing through on their way to the road. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few days were uneventful, and I started to forget about the figure. But then, one evening as I was heading to the barn to feed the chickens, I saw them again. This time, they were standing further back in the field, just barely visible in the fading light. Their posture was the same, rigid and unnatural. I shouted again, but they didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed the beam at the spot where they were standing, but the light revealed nothing but rows of corn. Over the next week, I began noticing other strange things. At night, I'd hear soft whispers coming from the corn, faint and indistinct, as though carried on the wind. One morning, I found strange markings in the dirt near the edge of the field, long, thin grooves, almost like claw marks. I told my parents about what I'd been seeing and hearing, but they brushed it off. "Probably just some kids messing around," my dad said. "You know how it gets out here." Still, I couldn't shake the growing unease. Something about the field felt wrong. The turning point came one night when I was sitting on the porch, unable to sleep. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the corn. I was staring at the field, lost in thought, when I noticed movement. At first, it was subtle, just a ripple in the stalks. But then, one by one, figures began to emerge from the rows. There were at least 3 of them, all dressed in dark clothing, their movements slow and deliberate. They walked in unison, stopping just at the edge of the field, their faces obscured by shadows. My chest tightened as I watched them. They didn't speak or move closer. They just stood there, staring. Summoning every ounce of courage, I shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" No response. I ran inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. I peeked through the window, but they were gone. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Were they trespassers? Something else? The final encounter was the most terrifying. A few nights later, the power went out during a thunderstorm. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check the breaker box near the barn. As I made my way outside, the rain pelting down around me, I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The beam of my flashlight caught something moving in the field. I froze. Standing just a few feet away, partially obscured by the corn, was one of the figures. Their face was visible now, a pale, featureless mask with empty eye sockets. I turned to run, but the figure lunged toward me, its movements unnaturally fast. I tripped over the wet grass and scrambled to my feet, sprinting back to the house. When I slammed the door shut behind me, I heard something scratching against the wood, but when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They were skeptical, but my dad agreed to check the field. He didn't find anything unusual, but I knew what I'd seen. After that, I couldn't stay on the farm. The thought of those figures still out there, watching, waiting, it was too much. I packed my things and left within the week. My parents thought I was overreacting, but I knew better. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that field, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska, where the flatlands stretched for miles and cornfields surrounded everything like a natural wall. The fields had always been part of life, so much so that I rarely thought about them. They were just there. A constant backdrop to quiet nights and humid summers. But one summer, when I was 19, those cornfields became the source of a story I'll never forget. A story I wish I could forget. It started when my friend Adam invited me to help him with a summer job on his uncle's farm. His uncle, Mr. Hartman, owned one of the largest properties in the area, hundreds of acres of corn that needed tending. Adam pitched it as easy money: walk the rows, clear weeds, check for pests. I didn't have much going on, so I said yes. The first couple of days were exactly what Adam promised, tedious but manageable. We'd walk through the rows, the towering stalks on either side creating a tunnel-like effect. The sun baked us during the day, and the cicadas screamed so loud it was hard to hear anything else. But by the end of the first week, things started to feel off. The first strange thing happened late one afternoon. Adam and I were working in different parts of the field, each checking our assigned rows. I was about halfway down mine when I noticed a patch of corn that seemed wrong. The stalks were shorter, their leaves shriveled and brown, like they'd been burned. At first, I thought it was some kind of disease, but the ground beneath them was strange too. The dirt was soft, almost spongy, and dotted with small, perfectly round holes. "Adam!" I called out, but the cicadas drowned out my voice. As I bent down to inspect one of the holes, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I turned, expecting to see Adam, but there was nothing there. The second strange thing happened a few days later. Mr. Hartman sent us out early in the morning to check the northern edge of the field. It was more isolated than the rest, bordered by a dense line of trees. As we walked the rows, Adam started complaining about feeling watched. "Probably just deer," I said, trying to reassure him. But as we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling either. The corn seemed denser here, the stalks growing closer together, almost like they were trying to block out the sunlight. And then there was the silence. No birds, no cicadas, nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. We were about to head back when Adam stopped suddenly, staring at something in the distance. "What is that?" he muttered. I followed his gaze and saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the field, just barely visible through the stalks. It was too far away to make out any details, but the way it stood, motionless, sent a chill down my spine. "Hey!" Adam shouted, waving his arms. The figure didn't move. "Let's go," I said, pulling on Adam's sleeve. We headed back to the farmhouse, neither of us saying much. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was coming from outside my window. I got up and looked out, but all I could see was the cornfield, the stalks swaying gently in the moonlight. The whispers stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. The next day, Adam and I found another patch of withered corn, this one even larger than the first. The same strange holes dotted the ground, and the air around them smelled faintly of decay. As we inspected the patch, Adam noticed something sticking out of the dirt. It was small and metallic, reflecting the sunlight. He pulled it out and held it up. It was a watch. "That's weird," I said. Maybe someone lost it? Adam frowned. It's not broken or anything. How would it end up buried here? We didn't have an answer. The whispers returned that night, louder this time. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding the house. I couldn't make out any words, just a low, constant murmur that set my teeth on edge. I looked out the window again, and this time I saw movement in the field. Shadows flitted between the rows, too fast to be animals. The next morning, Adam told me he'd heard the whispers too. This place is starting to freak me out, he admitted. Mr. Hartman dismissed our concerns, chalking everything up to wild animals or exhaustion. The summer heat messes with your head, he said. Don't let your imagination run wild. But things only got worse. One afternoon, while checking the rows, I heard Adam shout my name. I ran to where he was, finding him standing over a patch of freshly disturbed dirt. Look at this, he said, pointing. Sticking out of the dirt was a boot. We stared at it for a long moment, either of us wanting to say what we were both thinking. Maybe it's just garbage, I said, though I didn't believe it. Adam grabbed a stick and started digging around the boot. The more dirt he cleared away, the more it became clear it wasn't garbage. It was a leg. We sprinted back to the farmhouse, breathless and panicked. Mr. Hartman seemed unfazed when we told him. This land's been farmed for decades, he said. Sometimes old things turn up. Don't worry about it. Old things don't wear boots, Adam snapped. Mr. Hartman didn't respond. That night, we decided to leave. Whatever was happening on that farm, it wasn't normal, and we didn't want to stick around to find out. But as we packed our things, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder than ever, almost deafening. When we stepped outside, the cornfield was alive with movement. The stalks swayed violently, though there was no wind, and shadows darted between the rows. And then we saw them. Figures emerged from the field, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved slowly, deliberately, their shapes barely human. Adam grabbed my arm. Run! We bolted toward the truck, but the figures moved faster than they should have been able to. As we climbed inside and slammed the doors, they surrounded the vehicle, their faces pressing against the windows. I'll never forget those faces. They weren't human. They were hollow, their eyes empty sockets, their mouths stretched into silent screams. We peeled out of there, the figures vanishing into the night as quickly as they'd appeared. The next day, we reported everything to the sheriff, but when they investigated, they found nothing. No boot, no withered patches, no figures. Just rows of corn, swaying peacefully in the breeze. Adam and I never went back to that farm. To this day, I can't drive past the cornfield without feeling that same, suffocating fear. I don't know what we saw out there, but whatever it was, it didn't want us to leave. I've lived in Iowa my whole life, surrounded by cornfields that stretch as far as the eye can see. It's the kind of place where nothing much happens, quiet, predictable, and safe. At least, that's what I used to believe. This story happened 5 years ago, during late October. The harvest had just ended, and the days were getting shorter. The air had that crisp, earthy smell of fall, and the fields were mostly empty, the corn already picked clean. My friends and I had this tradition of exploring the old, unused fields at night. We called it stalking the rows, a dumb game where we dared each other to walk the rows alone in the dark. It was supposed to be a joke, something to pass the time in a boring town. But that night, it turned into something I'll never forget. There were 4 of us that night, me, Eric, Megan, and Jake. We met up at Eric's farm, where his family owned hundreds of acres of fields. Most of the corn had been harvested, but some patches remained, left for livestock or to rot over the winter. Eric was the one who suggested it. Let's hit the back field, he said, grinning as he held up a flashlight. The back field was notorious in town. A few years earlier, an old man named Mr. Dillard had been found dead out there, collapsed in the rows. No one knew what had happened, heart attack, stroke, something like that. But people liked to tell stories about his ghost wandering the corn at night, looking for something. I don't know, man, Megan said, wrapping her jacket tighter. It feels different this time. Oh, come on, Eric said, rolling his eyes. You're not scared of some old ghost story, are you? Jake and I exchanged glances. We didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about the backfield that felt heavy, like the air was thicker out there. But peer pressure won, as it always does, and we headed out, flashlights in hand. The field was enormous, a sea of towering stalks stretching into darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting eerie shadows over the rows. We walked for a while, the four of us sticking close together. The corn swayed gently in the breeze, whispering as it brushed against itself. All right, Eric said, stopping suddenly. Who's first? First for what? Megan asked, narrowing her eyes. To walk the rows alone, obviously, Eric said, smirking. We all groaned, but that was the game. One by one, we were supposed to walk down a row, reach the other end, and come back. If you chickened out, you had to buy everyone snacks at the gas station on the way home. Jake went first, his flashlight bobbing as he disappeared into the rows. He returned a few minutes later, grinning. Piece of cake, he said, handing the flashlight to Megan. She hesitated but eventually took it, muttering something about us being idiots. When it was my turn, I felt that same unease creeping in, like the field was watching me. But I wasn't about to let Eric call me a coward, so I took the flashlight and stepped into the rows. The corn rose high on either side of me, blocking out the wind and muffling the sounds of the others. I walked slowly, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The stalks seemed to stretch endlessly, the path ahead narrowing the further I went. About halfway down the row, I heard it, a faint rustling behind me. I stopped, spinning around. Eric, if that's you, I swear to God. But there was no one there. Just the corn, swaying gently. I turned back and kept walking, my heart pounding. The rustling came again, louder this time, like something was moving through the stalks. Eric? I called out, my voice shaking. Still no answer. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something ahead, a figure standing at the end of the row, silhouetted by the moonlight. I blinked, and it was gone. When I made it back to the group, I was shaking. Something's out there, I said, handing the flashlight to Eric. He laughed. Yeah, sure. Let me guess, Mr. Dillard's ghost? I'm serious, I said, my voice rising. I heard something. And I saw someone. Eric rolled his eyes. You're just trying to scare us. Without another word, he turned and strode into the rows, the flashlight beam disappearing quickly. We waited for him to come back, but as the minutes dragged on, my unease grew. Shouldn't he be back by now? Megan asked, her voice trembling. Maybe he's trying to scare us, Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. We called out for Eric, but there was no response. Finally, I grabbed another flashlight from my bag. I'm going after him. The three of us entered the rows, sticking close together. The air felt colder now, heavier, and the corn seemed taller, the rows tighter. We called Eric's name over and over, but the only response was the rustling of the stalks. And then we found it, his flashlight, lying in the dirt, the beam pointing upward. But there was no sign of Eric. Panic set in. We argued about what to do, call the police, go back to the house, keep looking. But before we could decide, we heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling for help. Eric! Megan shouted, running toward the sound. Wait! I yelled, chasing after her. We followed the voice deeper into the field, the rows twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The voice grew louder, but it sounded wrong, distorted, almost mechanical. When we finally reached the source, we stopped dead in our tracks. Standing in the middle of a small clearing was Eric. Or something that looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was hollow, like a recording played through a broken speaker. Help me, he said, his head tilting unnaturally. Jake grabbed my arm. "That's not him," he whispered. Before we could move, the figure lunged at us, its movements jerky and inhuman. We ran, the corn closing in around us, the whispers growing louder. We didn't stop until we burst out of the field, gasping for air. The police searched the field the next day but found no sign of Eric. To this day, I don't know what we saw in that clearing. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear his voice, calling for help from somewhere deep in the rows.